It's always good to follow Michael because I don't think there's probably anybody in the world that has the actual perspective and vision of general practice, particularly at a global level. Now, can I open up my presentation? I wondered how I got this gig. In November last year, I actually was speaking at this generational change stuff, and I'm very much not the technical generation. I was speaking at a pre-internship conference close to here in Sydney, and a week or so after I got an invitation to speak at the GPRA conference, which has now become your strategy session. I wasn't really surprised because the speaker immediately before me at that particular conference was a guy called Gordian Fulder, who if you're from New South Wales you probably know, but I think he was Senior Australian of the Year last year. Lovely guy, great entertainer, has run emergency department at St Vincent's Hospital, one of our busy inner city hospitals for many years. But Gordian got up at this particular pre-internship conference and said, "My parents were both doctors, my wife's a doctor, my daughter are both doctors. There's never been a worse time to be a doctor." It wasn't surprising that my speech after that was going to be seen as relatively positive, and I think that's why I got the invitation here. But really, it's a great time to be a doctor. It's a great time to be working in general practice, and I'm as envious as hell of those of you that are actually embarking upon that career and looking at it over the next 40 years or so, and I'll explain why in a moment. I was going to speak about generational change, and having to condense that from what was going to be an hour presentation into 20 minutes, I'm going to skip through a few things, but it's important, I guess, initially to look at, the whole generational change theory. I know you can't see these slides particularly well, but don't worry, most of them are pictures. I'm just going to speak briefly to them. Basically, generational change theory, and it has been challenged. I like it because it explains my observations of what I see in life. Basically, it says that our personalities, or our range of personalities, the narcissists, the sociopaths, the normal people, don't particularly change over generations. What does change over generations is the experiences that we're exposed to, particularly at formative times of our lives, like when we're young adolescents. So up until about the age of 10, you're enclosed in the cocoon of your family. But from about 10 to 18 or 20, you're very much exposed to the broader world, and what you see tends to shape the way you react to the world in the future. So for those of you that have grandparents who sort of went through the Depression, or in my case, my parents, and then later the years of the Second World War, those people are frugal. Even if they've got buckets of money now, they cannot spend that money because that was their formative years. Other people will challenge this, and an alternative model is that actually we all just mature as we get older, and these changes are age-related. And there's probably room to accommodate both models. I'm always amazed when I sit with my baby boomer colleagues and they can't remember what it was like to be 7 or 15 or 25, and the whole world gets seen from their perspective of a grumpy 60-year-old man shaking their jowls and talking about young people today. And you'll work with people like that as well, but I still think the underlying basis of understanding why people act the way they do is very useful in terms of generational theory. And the corollary of that is there's nothing particularly new. Sorry, this is one behind here. So, we might think that tattoo art is relatively new, but this is a 19th century picture, and imagine what that woman in the 19th century, what her mother probably said when she went home and showed her tattoos. My daughter, who's now 28, when she was about 14 or 15, went through a phase where she wouldn't catch public transport. And living in Sydney, you really need to use public transport. She was an outgoing sort of girl, and I thought, is this the start of some sort of social phobic disorder or something? At the time, I was starting to look at generational change theory, and suddenly the light went on. What was happening in the media? What was happening in the world at the time she was that age? Madrid bombings, London bombings, those sorts of things. So again, just examples of why particular groups of people and why labels will be applied to the millennials or Gen X or Gen Y, or in my case, the baby boomers. What I'm going to very quickly run through and skip over, but really throw them in because I want you to think about them over the next couple of days as you're strategising for the future of GPRA. What is general practice? And Michael's done a lot of that already. The big question, anywhere I go, and as well as GPED, I was on the board of Health Workforce Australia during the 4 years of its existence, and sadly it was folded up, another victim of Peter Dutton's, at around the time where it was probably starting to do some useful stuff. But will there be jobs? What about the stakeholders? And again, Michael's alluded to some of those. really important challenge I'm going to throw out there is our social contract with the community. I mean, as doctors, we tend to be locked into a particular paradigm that's been out there and been valued for many years. But if we're actually going to survive and be resilient and sustainable, is it time to actually renegotiate the terms of that social contract? I'm going to talk about the importance of resilience, and there's a lot in the media about resilience currently, but also the value of serendipity. As doctors, we tend to be obsessive, highly organised, high-performing, high-achieving, all of those things. Lots of studies have confirmed it, and they're good. Our patients love those characteristics. What we're not terribly good at is going with the flow, sitting back and just seeing what happens and looking for the opportunities that might arise out of that sometimes. And last of all, what I call growing old disgracefully, which isn't about you guys, it's actually me, but thinking about how can you actually disrupt, but in a productive and innovative way, actually challenge the paradigms that sometimes hold us back and are changing anyway. What is general practice? You probably can't even read this slide. This is our college definition going back to 2011. I love it, but it also scares the hell out of me because it says we're basically all things to all people. And it very much matches to the paradigm of our social contract that our lives are about our service to our clients and to our communities. It really doesn't say much about us and our sustainability there. One of the things I really like is that last paragraph. The patient's needs, values and desired health outcomes always remain central to the GP's evaluation and management processes. And that's really critical because it's really talking about patient-centred care. Nobody does patient-centred care like general practice. We're still not perfect at it, but we've got a 20-year jump on the other groups who are only just starting to understand that. And it's at the core of everything we do, and we'll talk about it in terms of sustainability again in a moment. Michael's already alluded to the discussions that have been out there for the last 20 years or so, from some people who aren't from primary care backgrounds, who are actually getting it and saying, actually, if we're going to improve outcomes if we're going to improve outcomes in a manner that's affordable to our communities and affordable globally, then we've got to look better at investing in primary care. A predecessor of Michael's as the Wonka president, Rich Roberts, was out here some years ago, and he talked about how he'd analysed the literature in terms of what he should be doing as a good GP. And those of you that are working in general practice currently will be familiar with some of these challenges. All the stuff you've got to do to be a good doctor. Okay, managing those chronic conditions. Well, Rich worked out he had to spend 10.5 hours a day managing those chronic conditions. He had to spend another 7.5 hours a day doing preventive services to his community. This was for the patient base that he served in rural North America. Then he still had to include the things that the patient might bring in, as well as doing the stuff he wanted to do in terms of managing their chronic care, their chronic conditions and good preventive care. He still had to be prepared for the stuff they might present on the day. He still had to then deal with the emergencies and the acute care issues that were going to walk through the door. And on top of that, he had to be a good administrator. Now, if you start adding up those sorts of hours, it's impossible. And one of the challenges, and I think it's a fun and a good challenge for you guys, is going to be we've got to change the model of practice as we do it. We've got to get away from the 10 and the 15-minute consultations. Where I'm working currently, we've piloted a whole new clinic called a men's clinic. And the goal of it, we didn't want it to be one of those executive health clinics where we just scared the wits out of very wealthy men and did all these unnecessary tests and charged a mozza for it. We actually we've based what we do based on the college preventive care guidelines, evidence-based guidelines, and we expected that we would see middle-aged to older men close to retirement from our community coming into it. It's the 20 and 30-year-old guys that are coming in. They're paying $250 to spend an hour with a GP. They love it, and our doctors love it. And most of our doctors working in this clinic are young doctors, and they say, I get so much more, and the patient gets so much more out of spending an hour with them. And we used to think only the physicians and the surgeons and people like that could do it. The reality is we know many of the consultants spend 5 minutes with the patient and charge a large amount of money. But we've got to look at how we can incorporate this into our practice, how we can sell the model as an appropriate model, and how we can, of course, still run sustainable and viable practices at a time, and Michael's alluded to it, when the government has clearly said there's not going to be a lot more money left in healthcare. The question, will there be jobs? Now, this is not new, this is cross-generational. I graduated at the end of 1979. We had a double graduation at that particular year. We weren't going to have jobs. There was going to be too much competition. It's part of our hard wiring as doctors. Remember those obsessive, anxious characteristics that our patients love and got us into and through medical school? They feed into these sorts of things as well. We have virtually zero unemployment. I always say, show me a doctor who wants to work, not a doctor who says, well, I didn't get on to the XYZ surgical specialty training program, which is where I'd like to be, but show me a doctor who wants to work who can't work. And I've never found one yet. But we have, basically zero unemployment. We may have to look behind doors that we weren't expecting to knock on in the first place. But there will be jobs. Julia Gillard said this about the automotive industry when she was Prime Minister. There will be jobs, but they won't be the same jobs. And that quote really resonated with me because healthcare is going through the biggest transformation, probably belatedly. We probably should have done it 30 years ago at the beginning of the digital revolution. But everything that we do is going to be turned on its head. And again, in primary care, where we're used to diversity, we're used to moving from one sphere to another, we're probably better positioned to do this than our colleagues who work in silos. Michael referred to them as vertical programs. It's a polite way of saying silos, and so much of healthcare is siloed. As in primary care and general practice, we're used to working across silos. In Health Workforce Australia, we were starting to actually do some workforce projection and planning. And if you look at the medical workforce projections out to 2025, there really wasn't any evidence. And remember, by this stage, we already had all the new medical schools online. We already were factoring in high rates of migration from doctors who trained overseas. And really, there's no particular evidence that we're going to be oversubscribed with doctors in the future. If there's a little bit of competition, is that a bad thing? I would argue probably not from the perspective of our patients. But there's no evidence that we're going to be significantly oversubscribed. As I say to many young doctors, I hope you're not going to burn yourself out doing 60 hours a week of clinical practice. I hope you're going to be educators, administrators, doing governance. Doctors actually do governance really well. They're altruistic, they're not self-interested. They probably would be much better politicians than most of the politicians we've got at the moment. So even though our head count of doctors will be higher, most of us will be doing maybe 20 or 30 hours of clinical practice. Hopefully not too many of us are doing no clinical practice because that creates other problems when we become managers and policy writers. Stakeholder management, and again, Michael's alluded to some of the stakeholders out there. This is a fun time. I keep using the word Ubered at the moment as a verb. I suspect that people who think they have control of how the health system runs are going to be Ubered. Governments on both state and federal levels have really dropped the ball and said it's all too hard, and different models and different paradigms are going to arise, and if the government thinks it can actually control what's happening, a bit like what we've seen with the electronic health record. Well, they've faffed around for 10 years. We'll probably develop systems. Hopefully they'll be good systems, but the risk of bad leadership from a federal level has been that we could end up with models that we're not happy with or don't work in our patients' best interests. But regardless, there are a lot of players out there. There are a lot of commercial players. There are a lot of other groups. One group that I feel particularly positive about is the primary health networks, but I'm not going to say anything more because Di's going to speak particularly about them. But when I first got involved with them after I stepped down from the GPET board some years ago, I thought, oh, it's just the same as the old divisions of general practice. And this light went on, it's not the same. And the reason it's not the same is it's not just about GPs. It's actually about communities and all of the providers in the communities. And that sort of, again, focus on the patient, focus on communities, focus on global health. Mentioning specific stakeholders, and there are two particular colleges that are particularly aligned with what you guys are training for. I think the colleges have some significant challenges. I think the risk, and I think Michael alluded to it again, if you're an organisation as GPRA, what do your members get out of belonging to your college? I think the RACGP at the moment is going through a real crisis where I think they've lost contact and stopped asking. They've started telling. Think about the model of general practice in 2017. Do we still tell our patients what's best for them? No, we actually talk to them about what the options are and we help them make informed decisions. And at the moment our college isn't doing that for us. So I think the college, it'll be there, but it's going to actually have to lift its game. And my prediction, and I've been saying this for at least 15 years and see no reason to change it, about the colleges generally, and if the College of GPs has some issues, boy, I think colleges of physicians and some of the other smaller colleges have some real issues. We will no longer tolerate silos of care. They don't work for our communities and they certainly don't work for the colleges and their members. The colleges that adapt by becoming more flexible, more porous, part-time training, career flexibility, porous college boundaries, the GP who wants to become an emergency physician, the GP who wants to become a geriatrician. Why can't we do those sorts of things? It's illogical, and it's defined by very narrow, rigid college boundaries at the moment. And I think there'll probably be fewer colleges through mergers in the future rather than more. And again, we're very well positioned. I suspect in the next 10 years, everybody's going to want to partner with our two colleges, ACRM and RACGP, and develop ways to make their current members' careers more flexible and sustainable. The social contract stuff, this is a bit of a heads up. This is, I think, going to be in AusDoc next week. I wrote an article. You'd be aware we've had a spate of suicides, particularly among young physician trainees here in New South Wales recently. I sat on the committee of inquiry we had, which was set up by the government. All the calls are the same. Some of you will have received emails last night from Ben Vaness and others, as I did, saying, we need a committee of inquiry, we need a commission into this. We do, but we did it 10, 20 years ago and nothing has changed. And we have to say we need a different approach to this. And part of that is us taking responsibility, not expecting all those other external stakeholders necessarily to change, because they often don't, but us saying, okay, we're going to renegotiate the terms of that social contract. Because, as I've already said, don't we and don't our young doctors deserve a work environment that's physically, emotionally, socially and financially sustainable? Once again, I think GPs and GP registrars are actually much further advanced down this track than many of our peers. I'm supervising a young woman at the moment who's doing her PhD on resilience among physician trainees. It is a tragic wasteland out there among the physician trainees. And I can't say too much because we still haven't published a lot of that. But there are all sorts of issues. And one of the saddest things is the people who should be mentoring the young trainees, every time we talk to them, they don't get it because they're burnt out. There's this intergenerational burnout there that the senior physicians are actually incapable of recognising the stress of the junior physicians because they're still dealing with the stuff from their own training. The essential role of resilience. I know it's sort of an overused word at the moment, but basically it's what it's all about. It's about keeping yourself on the healthy part of this stress performance curve. We don't want to be bored, we don't want to be down here, and a lot of people that complain about bullying or not liking the work or being worked too hard are actually bored in their workplaces. I realised this a few years ago when I made a significant career change. One of my problems was not the workplace, it was me. I was bored in the workplace. So we need stimulation, but we need support, and we need to keep on this exciting part of the curve. If the stimulation or if the stress gets too great or the support isn't there, then we become dysfunctional, it leads down into burnout and other negative outcomes. I'm going to whip through some of these so that we finish on time. And resilience really, and there's a good article, I won't read through all about it, but Canadian Family Physician Journal back in 2008 actually did a lovely definition of resilience, about having healthy attitudes and perspective, including self-awareness, and that's probably the most important thing, and accepting your personal limitations. Balancing and prioritisation. You can't be all things to all people, and that comes again to renegotiating that social contract. Having a management style and recognising that being a great clinician isn't what it's all about, and being altruistic, won't sustain you, that you actually have to work on your personal management styles. And of course, having that community safety net there, the supportive relationships that help you through the difficult times. This was a photo I took when I was down in Mona some years ago when they had the suicide exhibition down there. And some days in practice, I think we all feel like this. For those that can't read it, it's basically a computer slide, and it's part of the suicide system that's been set up in some countries by the Netherlands. And at one stage, you get this: in 15 seconds, you'll be given a lethal injection, yes or no. I don't work well under pressure. I would be really, which button should I push? Oh my God, I pushed the wrong button. And the flip side of that is the value of serendipity. I think I learned this early in my career when I decided not to stay on at the big teaching hospital where I was, a professorial unit intern. I didn't even apply for a second-year job because I thought I'd like to be a rural GP, and they certainly weren't going to teach me that in inner city Sydney. And people told me I was crazy. Your life will be over, your life will be ruined. And at that stage, I developed this mental analogy of actually there's a whole lot of doors out there, and sometimes if you knock on a door, it doesn't open, but that means there's 19 other doors, often in the same room, and behind them are all sorts of exciting and interesting things. And some of the best things that have happened to me personally and professionally have been when a door that I thought I wanted to go through didn't open, and I had to go through one of those other doors. So a few tips. And again, I think you need to incorporate this into what is the purpose of GPRA and what are you offering and doing in terms of supporting your members. You've got your whole life to do it. I'm constantly amazed at the talent, and having worked a lot with medical students and doctors in training, at the talent and the leadership skills of my younger colleagues. Certainly I didn't have anything like that at that particular age, but I also see them burn out, and one of the recent suicides was probably a tragic example of that. Stop, smell the flowers. If you ever go to any international doctors' health conference, you'll see gnarled old people who have been writing about doctors' health all of their lives, and they all stand up and say, I wish I'd spent more time with my family. I wish I'd stopped and smelled the flowers. Nobody ever says, I wish I'd worked more. Self-awareness, and that's the key. And again, that comes back to that renegotiating your social contact. Your patients and your communities will tell you you're perfect and you're wonderful and you're indispensable, but you've got to know what your vulnerabilities are. And don't be a victim. We're doctors. We've actually got the means to control the things that happen to us. We're not true victims, and if we're in terrible circumstances, terrible employment, step away from it if you can't change it. And again, being brave enough, using our organisations to support it, change the situations if we can, but that change is often glacially slow. We have to take responsibility in the short term, and find yourself appropriate mentors. And if you haven't got those people who you talk to and you phone up when you're at a sort of a crossroads in your life, make sure you find them, and make sure they're a bit broader than the traditional mentors that many of us as doctors sort of have been mentored or pushed by through our lives. Now finally, just talking about growing old disgraceful, and this is something I enjoy doing more and more, and it's not about having tantrums. Angry young men and women get tolerated, but angry middle-aged or angry older men and women just look like they're grumpy. So it's about trying to be constructive, but challenging some of the paradigms that are out there. Evidence-based medicine, everything is evidence-based, and anything that's changed, it's because of the evidence. Now, I've just spent 2 years on the NHMRC working group looking at the prostate cancer screening guidelines. We looked at 4,000 articles, and the articles at the end were coming in faster than we could process them. So what we did is we drew a line and said, we're not considering any articles after this particular time. What that means is that the guidelines that are out there that are evidence-based are actually out of date already, and the stuff is changing as we think about it. The other thing about evidence-based guidelines is people often stop at, this is what the study said. They don't incorporate that last paragraph of the definition of general practice, and the one that was in Dave Sackett's original research work saying you've got to contextualise it and apply it in the context of the needs of the patients. The community context, the patient needs. So evidence is fine, and we don't want to resile for that, but we don't want evidence used as a weapon to bully us into doing what a particular academic has done their PhD on and thinks we should be doing, because often that level of evidence is not good. I speak a lot on back pain. The evidence around back pain is crap. Don't use Panadol, don't use non-steroidals. Physio doesn't work. And, how does that help you guys treating low back pain? And when you actually look at the evidence, you can understand why it says that, because it's not particularly well done research. This is a photo of my staff looking up the guidelines for something in our practice recently. And I've come to describing guidelines as fossils, because they are. Essentially, they're a fossil record of what contemporary thinking was at a particular point in time. And the problem is, in the digital era where knowledge is growing exponentially, is that you have to I'm not saying don't follow the guidelines. You need to look at the guidelines, but it's also okay to think about, well, what new evidence is there? What is the context of my patient? How can I justify what I'm doing? I'll finish with a quote. Some of you will know this already, but you can guess who said it. And I'll read it because it's such an important thing, from about 10 years ago. It's becoming conventional wisdom that recent medical graduates are reluctant to accept the responsibility of sole practice in country areas or to work long and antisocial hours. If so, what coming generations of doctors might gain in lifestyle, oh, that terrible thing, lifestyle. I never had a lifestyle and none of my wives ever complained. Could be offset in lost community standing through foregone opportunities to serve and inspire others. It wasn't that the doctors of previous generations are workaholics. We know many of them were alcoholics. Rather, they had a finely honed, are you feeling guilty yet? A finely honed sense of a hierarchy of needs, and believes that the mark of a leader was to look after others first. This is the part that you'll love. In those more stoical times, medical families were prepared to accept that they had to share their, note, husband and father, with people whose immediate need might be greater than theirs. So this is the traditional paradigm that we grew up in by a very traditional baby boomer. Anybody know who said that? Tony Abbott, when he was our health minister back in 2005. And of course, Alastair Sim from the old Ebenezer Scrooge movie. And what was Ebenezer's, catchline? Lifestyle. His was Christmas, but lifestyle, humbug. And that's what a lot of we baby boomers do. The good thing was that even then in 2005, some of our contemporary baby boomers got back and really took it to Tony Abbott. I love Sam Hurd's quote. Some of you will know Sam from the Northern Territory. I recall how outrageous it seemed at the time when a GP recruited to work in a remote community in the mid-1990s refused to do on-call work. Woman. But she stayed longer in a tougher environment than most. No on-call work is now normal practice for solo GPs in remote communities, and a very sensible decision in retrospect. Again, it's all about renegotiating that social contract and challenging the norms. We don't know what medical practice is in the future. Personally, I'm glad. I'm a GP because, as I describe to people, I have subsyndromal ADHD. I don't need medication. I just need diversity and challenge and variety in my life. It's a perfect definition of general practice. You guys are going to be working in these environments, and I think the best thing you can do as an organisation is encourage your members to stay positive, encourage them not to be afraid of the challenges and the uncertainty, but to put good strategic activities in place and strategic programs in place to make sure that your members are prepared for whatever happens. Everybody ends with a quote from Osler. Nobody ever knows this one, but I quite like this one, which basically sort of says that everything changes. Things that were, we said were rubbish 10 years ago are now mainstream. And if you think about guidelines, there's lots of quotes out there and evidence that, in 10 years, a lot of evidence, or 50% of evidence, will have been